Welcome back to the resurrection, defending what matters most. In Lesson 1, we learned what resurrection actually means. In Lesson 2, we covered what the resurrection accomplished, the redemption, reconciliation, and the resurrection body. And today, we'll be answering the question, was the resurrection planned? Because there are skeptics out there that want you to believe that the resurrection was made up. It was just a story that the disciples made after Jesus died. They needed a way to, say, keep the story going or something to sell, you might say. So they fabricated the resurrection myth. But the problem with that theory is the resurrection was prophesied from the very beginning. And it wasn't just thought up there at Jesus' death. Starting back at Genesis 3:15, right after the fall, God, he had a plan to redeem sinful mankind. Isaiah wrote 700 years later before Christ, and Jesus himself predicted his own death and resurrection multiple times. The resurrection was the plan from eternity past. So we'll be tracing the prophecies from Genesis to the Gospels, and by the end, you'll see that the resurrection was divine planning. And beginning there at Genesis 3:15, God had a plan to redeem sinful mankind. And this is right after Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. God is pronouncing judgment on the serpent, and he says, and I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. So this is the first prophecy of the Messiah in the Bible. The seed of the woman is Jesus, and he will crush the serpent's head. So it'll be a fatal blow. But in doing so, the serpent will bruise his heel. And that's just a painful, non-fatal wound. And so this is the cross and the resurrection in one verse. Jesus was wounded at the cross, and it looked like it was all over, but he ended up crushing Satan's head through the resurrection. The death could not hold him. So the resurrection, it was announced right there in Genesis 3, right after the fall. God had a plan to save mankind immediately. And then we'll fast forward about 2,500 years to the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah 53, one of the most detailed prophecies about the Messiah. And it was written 700 years before Jesus was born. And there, verse 5, but he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastising for our well-being was upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. So he was pierced, crushed, scourged, and that was for our sins. So this is really showing the suffering servant. This is Jesus at the cross. But, here's where most people miss. Isaiah 53 doesn't end with death, but it ends with the resurrection. Down in verse 10, he will see his offspring, and he will prolong his days. And, so you can't prolong your days if you're dead. Verse 11, as a result of the anguish of his soul, he will see it and be satisfied. Again, you can't see anything or be satisfied if you're dead in the grave. So Isaiah saw the resurrection 700 years before it happened. The Old Testament prophet pointed to the coming of the Messiah, and he also pointed to the resurrection. Not only the Old Testament, but Jesus himself predicted his own death, betrayal, and resurrection. He did that multiple times in the Gospels. One of the times was around Caesarea Philippi. Jesus tells his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer, be killed, and he'll be raised on the third day. That was in Matthew 16 and Mark 8. Another time after the transfiguration, Jesus said he would be delivered into men's hands, and they will kill him. And he'll rise on the third day. That's in Matthew 17, Mark 9, and Luke 9. Third time, he said he would be handed to the Gentiles, mocked, flogged, crucified, and raised on the third day. That's Matthew 20, Mark 10, and Luke 18. So Jesus told the disciples plainly 3 times that he would die and rise again on the third day, but they missed it. And we know that they missed it because right after that, that Jesus told them about this coming beating and crucifixion, James and John let their mother ask, hey, can my boys have a favored position? There in Matthew 20. So they weren't even thinking about the cross or even the resurrection. They were thinking about, political power, where Jesus is going to come in and take over. The disciples wanted deliverance from Rome immediately. They wanted Jesus to be the conquering king right now. But that's not the route that God had for Jesus. He did not come as a conquering king. He came as a baby, as a suffering servant. He came to die and rise from the grave to beat sin and death. And the disciples wanted a throne, but God gave a cross for Jesus to endure. But, the cross wasn't the end. It was the means to the resurrection. And, with the resurrection, it confirmed Jesus' position as a true prophet. Many of his prophecies have come to fulfillment, but all will in time. Paul said that God was raised from the grave in 1 Corinthians 15:15. And the divine passives in the gospel show that God was the obvious agent behind the scenes making it work. God was the one doing the work, as we see in Matthew 28. But there in John 2:19, Jesus makes a crazy claim. He says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And the Jews thought he was talking about the physical temple, but John tells us he was speaking about his own body. So, he claimed to raise himself from the grave. And, think about what that means. Only God can raise someone from the dead. So when Jesus claimed he would raise himself from the dead, he was claiming to be God. And we know he did it. He did raise himself from the grave, proving that he is the authentic prophet of God and ultimately that he is God. This was the divine planning and divine power that allowed Jesus to resurrect from the grave. So that's lesson 3, resurrection foretold. God planned this from Genesis 3:15. Isaiah prophesied it 700 years before Jesus came, and then Jesus predicted it 3 times that he would resurrect himself. Next week, lesson 4, was Jesus really dead? And we'll be tackling the historical proof that Jesus actually died, because some people think that he didn't die, that he just laid there in the tomb. They call it the swoon theory. So I have details in the description. I'll send you a free PDF of this study if you want. Or if you actually like a physical copy, it's something that can be purchased on Amazon. And, share this with someone who needs to see that, the resurrection wasn't made up. And thanks for watching.